Okay, so that's enough about a game that was probably kind of meaningless in the grand scheme of things relative to the playoff perception and outlook and going forward. So let's talk a little bit about Michigan and Ohio State. My goodness, what a game. On one hand, 27-30 sounds awesome, but then you look at it and it's like, okay, that's double overtime. 640 yards combined for both of these teams with those extra frames. So it was kind of ugly. We called that. We said it was going to be an ugly game. We said it was going to be a close game. We did not expect Spate to come out. He comes out, actually plays a decent game, but when you look into the stats, 6.1 yards per attempt and 2.1 yards per rush for Michigan, which I think kept them from being able to sustain some drives to really put the game away. They had to rely on the pass too much. He threw it 36 times, which you don't need from an injured quarterback. So maybe get into this a little bit. I've got some other thoughts on this game, but I just want a high level sort of outlook of what you saw and sort of, was it what you expected, and where do we go from here?
We disagreed on this game. I thought Michigan would win by a close margin. You thought Ohio State would win. Unfortunately, didn't make it in the video, but we ended up running the model, and I think what it was it Michigan 33, Ohio State 32.5
Yeah.
is what it said, which both showed how close it was, and two, I know it took overtime to get there, but again, really wasn't that far off from the final score. Uh, yeah, it was a little bit different than I expected. I thought Michigan would be able to run it a little better than they did, but I don't think there was any doubt that Spate was not 100%. He may have been in the game, and I think he was in the game because they had serious concerns with O'Kern, particularly after that, the Iowa game and where they've been at without him. I mean, I don't think they really had any confidence coming out of the Indiana game either that O'Kern was going to be able to do anything. So they knew they needed Spate to be able to run their offense. They've already seen that if they don't have a good passing game, things really start to slow down. But Spate was really there just to keep the other team honest, take the easy play. Everything they were doing were little simple bootleg throws to the tight end, keeping everything in front of Spate with easy throws. And they were using him basically to make the easy throw because they knew they had an experienced quarterback that could run the offense. They weren't really asking him to generate a whole lot. And when he tried to throw down the field, it ended badly in a few instances, right? But I thought they would be able to run the ball a little bit better than this. 2.1 yards per carry just isn't going to cut it. Michigan's offensive line, I was shocked at how outmanned they were. I mean, Ohio State is not overly physical, but they are very athletic in the front seven. I mean, they are certainly physical by most standards, but not by the standards from the past few years. The thing that's really defining this team is they have a tremendous amount of talent, so they're very quick and disruptive. They just haven't quite grown into their frames yet, but they were in the backfield constantly. In the flip side, it was a lot of what I expected from Ohio State. We both talked about the fact that JT Barrett has not been in any way successful throwing the ball when they have no real run game, right? They had to be very successful to run the ball in order to set up some passes. Everything had to be short. Barrett only had 3.9 yards per attempt. That's pretty miserable. They ran the ball okay. I am confused, surprised, and shocked that JT Barrett had 30 carries in the ball game for 4.2 yards. 30 of the 50 carries went to JT Barrett. That was entirely too many to take away from Curtis Samuel and Mike Weber. Samuel had a pretty impressive average. Granted, a lot of that was a couple chunk plays, but it was pretty clear. Michigan said, "We'll give you 4 yards per play with Barrett if we can continually, basically, we're going to play the dive every time and make the quarterback keep it, and then we're going to go deal with Barrett down the field and keep getting shots on your quarterback and not letting you establish the run game." Ohio State, we both watched this game. It's pretty start to finish. Ohio State scores 2 touchdowns, one on a pick six. I mean, one's an interception on the 15-yard line. Michigan, for about 3.5 quarters, really dominated this game. It's just they made crucial mistakes at the wrong time. Partly, as we've talked about a lot, when you can't run the ball successfully, it puts a tremendous amount of strain on you to try to generate offense, which tends to lead to mistakes. And there was a point in this game when Michigan's up, gets up 10 points that or 17, what was it? I guess 17-7 maybe. That I don't know about you, but I almost felt like at 17-7, Michigan could have just run the ball three times and punted every drive, and they probably would have won the ball game. Instead, as soon as they get up 17-7, they throw an interception on their own 15-yard line, and give Ohio State a chance to tie it. So I don't know. That's kind of my take.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I mentioned this to you in the middle of the game that even before the second interception, that Spate couldn't throw the ball downfield. So two things were at play here. One, it allowed Ohio State to run single safety at best, and they could walk basically everybody up, which I think fed into Michigan's inability to run the ball, where we've seen, Michigan State with Scott was able to run pretty successfully straight at Ohio State, and also Clement was really good in the Wisconsin game with some success there. So I didn't know that Michigan had the running back star power to get that done, but I thought in terms of scheme they could maybe have some success, like you. But Spate had nothing on the ball. So I think Ohio State learned early on that he wasn't much of a threat. It was underneath throws to butt all day long. And that was open early, but they adjusted. But honestly, for me, the big takeaway, just like you, was Barrett with 30 carries is crazy. Although to Ohio State's credit, they went with what they finally found to be working a little bit, and it got them the win. I don't know coming out of this if I'm an Ohio State fan. I have a whole lot of confidence in my offense, but I do have a good bit of confidence in my defense. Really, not only in terms of holding Michigan down to not a ton of points, but also finding ways to get points when your offense is absolutely doing nothing to get some points on the board and get you going. So I am surprised that Samuel didn't get more touches. He just seems to be sort of a spark for them. But in terms of this game in general, I just don't know. I mean, it is exactly what we thought, a really close game, and two teams that might be really, really good. But I don't know where Michigan goes if they can't throw the ball, because it seems like a lot of their offensive identity runs through a downfield threat and a really good, consistent route tree that they can run the whole thing with a good pro-style quarterback. So before we get into Ohio State and their postseason opportunities and things like that, talk a little bit about Michigan and where they go from here with a potentially limited offense.
Yeah, first, I do want to agree, by the way, that when Michigan's defense, the lack of the downfield passing game absolutely let Ohio State crash down with, taking single high safety at best looks. I think that had a huge effect on the run game. Equally, they really held Barrett in check. I mean, he had a 2.9 yards per carry outside of 141-yard scramble. I know that's a big deal, but point being, 29 plays of the 50 runs were virtually meaningless. It really was just a couple plays that got away from them, and otherwise they had a very, very good run defense. So Michigan, Michigan's a very good team. I don't think, they're not going to make the playoff. That seems pretty clear at this point, but they're probably going to make a New Year's Six bowl. And looking at the tie-ins, it's hard to say where they end up. I think their tie-ins are the Rose and the Orange this year, so they're probably going to end up facing, maybe the winner or runner-up in the Pac-12, whoever that may be, and that's going to be, who knows who that's going to be. I mean, maybe it's Colorado, and maybe they don't send Colorado. Maybe they send Southern Cal, and that could make a big impact. But I think Michigan's going to be very, very competitive in whatever bowl game they face. They have an excellent defense. They have a good balanced offense when Spade is healthy. Shoulder injuries are always tricky. Sometimes they can be healed in terms of bowl season. Sometimes it may take them a year to get really healthy. He may be able to play, but you see this a lot, right? The guy can play, but he takes him 2 years before he's really 100% again. That's a lot like ACLs in that regard. And I don't know. I think Michigan's a very well coached team. I think they're going to be good moving forward. I think the biggest question mark for Michigan is, considering how much they suffered without Spate, I'm more curious to see how they are next year when they start having more departures. I mean, this was a pretty darn senior laden team. Darbo and Chesson, and you've got three seniors on the offensive line, that did struggle. You got a senior tight end, but that was so dramatic. You've got senior, running back and Davion and Smith, and Jabril Peppers is probably going to go pro. They at least get Spate back more than likely, but again, the defense. I mean, they lose almost everyone. Maybe the entire starting defense leaves. I mean, they only have one junior starting, and that's Jabril Peppers. So I think this will be a good year. I think they're going to have a very good chance of a win in a New Year's Six Bowl. And I think the real evaluation for Michigan comes next year when they basically have to completely hit the reset button.
All right, so let's talk about, you and I have talked a few times this year about Ohio State's limitations on offense, and I don't really want to beat that up anymore. We know what JT Barrett is and what he isn't, and we know where their struggles are going to be. But talk about how, if you're an Ohio State team, and let's say you face a Clemson in the first round of the playoffs, and whether or not they go to the playoffs is a discussion we're going to get into in a second. But let's say they play a Clemson in the first round of the playoffs. Tell me what their path to victory is. Instead of going negative, because we've done enough of that with the Big Ten in the last 2 weeks, let's go positive and let's talk about Ohio State in terms of not only just what we saw here, but what we know about this team in general in terms of personnel and what they've been able to do this year. How does an Ohio State, within the context of the limitations we know they have, get a win against a Clemson or a Washington in the first round of the playoffs?
Ohio State's strength is pretty much sheer athleticism and really physicality running the football. They don't have a lot of seniority anywhere on either side of the ball, right? With that massive class they had last year, really, record-setting draft class. But what they do have, it is a lot of athleticism. The receivers, to be frank, I think a lot of their issues throwing downfield, everybody puts it on JT Barrett. It's, to me, the problem throwing the ball downfield is JT Barrett had, a couple of years ago, a phenomenal set of receivers to throw to. And these guys are good, but they're young and they aren't quite as talented as the guys they used to have. Really, outside of Curtis Samuel, who gets used all over the field. But defensively, especially, very young, not always that big, but very fast, very explosive, very disruptive. So the good news for Ohio State is if they get matched up with Clemson or Washington, Clemson to some degree tries to establish the run, so does Washington, but both of them are kind of finesse run teams at times. Both of them are really downfield passing teams that try to stretch you vertically, and that's exactly the sort of team Ohio State wants to play. Ohio State can play physical at the point of attack, and neither Clemson or Washington is necessarily that big or strong at the point of attack. They're just disruptive. That kind of plays into Ohio State's wheelhouse. And then, they're both teams aren't going to try to pound Ohio State. They're going to try to finesse the ball downfield. And again, Ohio State can let their disruption come into play with all that talent they have, particularly in the back seven, and try to make a play. The team that is probably the worst matchup is likely Alabama, because I don't think, and it has, for any Big Ten fans, it's absolutely nothing to do with SEC. It's that Alabama is not a throwing team. Alabama is definitely a run-first power team in much the way that Michigan, by the way, is not. Alabama is, in many ways, a mirror image of Ohio State. And the team that Ohio State does not want to play this year is Ohio State. And Clemson and Washington are pretty much the polar opposite of Ohio State, and that's why I think it's a good matchup for them.
And just so people know, I wasn't saying that, I wasn't leaving out Alabama to suggest that Ohio State couldn't beat Alabama, but it's more likely that Ohio State isn't the 4 seed going into the playoffs. They're 2 or 3, which means most likely, unless Alabama loses to Florida, and I don't want to give that game away yet since we're going to review it. Unless Alabama loses to Florida, it's probably going to be either a Washington or a Clemson type team for Ohio State. I'm with you. I honestly think right now, given the mess that college football is this year, Ohio State's got a defense that's going to keep them in a game with anybody. And we've seen at times, and you've touched on this a little bit because of the comparisons that we've drawn to Jalen Hurts and JT Barrett in terms of there's some inconsistency there, but when he's on, he's really on. And for our Big Ten crowd, who it seems like we've gained a few fans over the last couple of weeks, in spite of us not being always so sunshine about the Big Ten. Maybe explain to them a little bit about the concept behind why Ohio State can have some success offensively, where we see them, they'll rack up a 45, 55 point type game, and in another game they might not get 15 points. Talk about how they utilize space players and speed to where it presents those matchup problems, to where they can, in an offense that seemingly struggles, can find games where they score a mountain of points.
Sure. Urban Meyer was one of the original spread coaches, dating back to his time at Bowling Green. Took it to Utah with Alex Smith, and then took it to Florida where he obviously had Tim Tebow. But throughout it all, the concept of that offense is you get the ball to your player in space, and you let him one-on-one outplay the guy in front of you. You need a couple things to do for that to work. One is you need a quarterback that can efficiently deliver the football. I'm not saying make good reads even, but just get the ball out quickly. It greatly helps if you have a mobile quarterback, because if the quarterback's mobile, that puts an added pressure on the defense. And every one of your bubble screens or flares has a run element to it, no matter what you're doing. So you can go spread formation and still have a power run because the quarterback's a runner. But at the end of the day, it's really about your player one-on-one beating the guy in front of you. Everybody kind of knows that concept, at least on the surface. But the key is, it's not just can you beat the guy in front of you, but it's also can you beat the defense as a whole. And when I say that, I mean, if you throw a bubble screen, right? Most quarterbacks get the bubble screen out in about the same amount of time. Some are a little bit faster, some a little bit slower. But the time it takes to execute the bubble screen and get the ball to the receiver, most of it is the time it takes for the ball to be snapped, the quarterback to step, turn. And when the ball comes out, some guys get it out a little faster than others, but the release of the football isn't a huge deal. So you have almost a set amount of time for the receiver to catch the football. When you play average to bad defenses, when he catches the football, the reaction time for the linebackers and the corners and the safeties is such that he probably has a 3 to 5 yard cushion when he catches the ball to start making a move, to get up to speed. As the quality of the defense increases, when he catches the ball, the defense reacts that much faster. Again, the receiver isn't moving. It doesn't matter how fast or quick he is. He's sitting waiting on the ball. And this is, again, a very typical sort of example in a spread offense. Again, whether you're running a sweep or zone read, a lot of stuff, the zone read, the mesh point, much of the play happens without the offensive player even moving. There's always this time it takes to set up the play. When the defense is fast, when they're well coached and well disciplined, that 3 to 5 yard gap, which lets you, you scoot around the first defender, and then the safety gets you, and it's a 7 yard play, right? Maybe you have a 1 yard window where you can cut inside the defender and run up. When you play a better defense, you don't get around that initial corner. That corner quickly and efficiently reads the play and crashes, and that 1 yard window becomes a 1 foot window. And instead of sneaking by him, that corner grabs you. And even if he doesn't, maybe he brings you down for a 1 yard gain. Maybe you break free, but then the linebacker and safety closes and it's a 4 yard gain. And the difference between a 7 yard gain on that play and a 1 and 4 yard gain is 2nd and 3 versus 2nd and 9 or 2nd and 6. And that completely changes the way the offense operates. Because in the first example, when those bubble screens are working well, and when the zone read, same basic concept. When you're playing a slower team and you run the mesh, you've got time to read the defensive end before he can get there and make the right play. But when you play, against Barnett or Myles Garrett, or in the SEC, in the Big Ten, the Joey Bosa types, when you run the mesh, you don't really have time to run it properly. He's going to attack the mesh point, and you're just going to have to do something. And it completely changes the way the play operates. You don't have the seam that you want to have. The blocker isn't out in front the way you want, and you tend to see things shut down. And in a play-for-play sense, and the perfect example of this to me in the past has been Oregon, and I would kind of rail on this. Oregon would be phenomenal when they played a bad team. because they had a lot of space to operate, and it let their quick players get the ball, turn around, see the defender, and make a move. And when they played a physical defensive team that could penetrate, and the classic example was always Stanford, though USC at times could do it too. All of a sudden, those plays, they would have disruption in the backfield, and instead of getting 6 yards per play, every play running the standard zone read bubble screen offense they would get 3 or 4. And what that meant is the other team could just sort of sit there and play defense play after play and be patient. And eventually they would get a tackle for loss or something, and Oregon would just stall. And when Oregon played a bad team and they got 6 yards per play, they would just march down the field. The other team would overcommit to the run, and then Oregon would pop them with some sort of downfield pass or a big play for a touchdown where the other team got too aggressive. So there's in spread offense, there's a huge disparity between the way it works against a really good defense and the way it works against everybody else. And it's nothing that the offense does right or wrong, really. It's just the amount of space you have to work with when you are at the mesh point or when you throw the ball quickly on a short route. And that's why really NFL teams don't run the spread, because NFL teams diagnose the ball, play, of course, extremely quickly. And if you try to run a bubble screen, standard college football bubble screen in the NFL, those corners are on you fast playing man coverage. And instead you have to run, you can have a short passing game, but it's got to be West Coast where you're actually throwing 4 or 5 yards down the field and expecting your, Edelman to catch the ball and fall down. Because in the NFL, just like against any good defense, and short plays, you don't have enough space when you catch the football to be able to generate anything, or when you're running the football to make a play in space. You've got to out physical the guy at the line of scrimmage, or you have to create a play downfield using a route tree. If you're playing a cover 2, there's certain plays that work. Cover 3, certain plays that work. Spread doesn't really matter what the other coverage is. You're just trying to get isolation. And so I've always felt like spread offenses, no matter how good the offense is always disproportionately affected the more effective the opposing defense is.
Okay, and honestly, I think what you just said and what we talked about here really does give some good insight into Ohio State. In terms of how it relates to the playoff, given what you just said, which do you think is the better matchup for Ohio State? Who do you think they want to draw? In my mind, it's Washington, given all the things you said, but in your mind, it might be different, and I'm curious to know which one it is and why.
I definitely think it's Washington. I mean, Washington has a good defense, and they're fairly quick, but Clemson is way more athletic, and more importantly, Clemson is way more disruptive. Clemson is probably a more disruptive defense, frankly, than anyone in the Big Ten other than Ohio State. And for that reason, I think Clemson can create some disruption and really slow down Ohio State's offense. I have doubts that Washington can really disrupt that efficiently or hold up the point that efficiently in the run game. And so if I'm Ohio State, I want to play Washington. I don't think that's shocking because I really think the other 3 teams, Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio State, are probably all likely a lot better than Washington. But just in terms of a pure matchup, it's the better matchup. In other words, you want to play Washington first. Clemson's probably the second most likely. And then I said Ohio State and Alabama are kind of mirrors of each other. But the truth is, Alabama's front 7 is absolutely ferocious. And they're extremely fast, and they're extremely disruptive, and they're extremely physical. And that matchup is going to be very difficult for Ohio State. Not because Alabama may be so much better, but it is exactly the sort of team this year that Ohio State probably does not want to play. And that's what I was saying earlier. I think they're a bit fortunate that they probably will not face Alabama in the first round. I hinted at that, didn't say it, because I think that it's a much better matchup to face one of the other 2 teams. And sort of see where you go from there.
Yeah, and I agree. If we see what Ohio State has struggled with the last 2 years, last year it was Michigan State. They couldn't move the ball against Michigan State, who actually did have a really good defense last year. And this year you see they've struggled with a Penn State, who plays pretty decent defense, and obviously Michigan, who does it as well.